Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with another lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1 at Madison Area Technical College. This lecture is part of our Unit 3 on the nervous system. And in it, I will cover the functional anatomy of the cerebrum. We're going to begin with superficial features of the cerebrum. It is indeed the largest part of the brain, and one of its features that's most notable is the bumps that appear on its surface. Of course, without grooves, there wouldn't be bumps. So we're going to name both the bumps and the grooves. The bumps are called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. Just to be clear, one bump is a gyrus, and one groove is a sulcus. You're given here the plural form. Gyri, that means bumps. Sulci, that means more than one grooves. A deeper slit that you can see in the brain is called a fissure. Now, usually this is true, but there's one exception, and that's the lateral sulcus, which is really quite deep. I don't know why it's not called a fissure. The lateral sulcus is labeled on the photograph of a brain on the lower left, and it separates the temporal lobe from the rest of the cerebrum. The transverse fissure, also another deep slit, is labeled on the picture on the left as well, and it separates the cerebellum, which is dark brown, from the cerebrum, which is a little bit more pink. The picture on the right shows the location of the longitudinal fissure, sometimes called the medial longitudinal fissure, other times called the sagittal longitudinal fissure. It's right in the midline of the cerebrum, and it separates the cerebrum into right and left hemispheres. If we look at a transverse section, horizontal section of the cerebrum, we can see some distinct features of the tissue as well. So I'm calling these histological features of the cerebrum. You can see that the cortex, which is the outer layer, is darker in color than the deeper tissue. The deeper tissue contains white matter. That darker tissue on the surface is called gray matter. The reason gray matter appears darker is because this is where there are many neuron cell bodies. Cell bodies have nuclei and other organelles that appear dark. The lighter tissue that I called white matter and is deeper, it appears lighter because there's myelin present in those locations. And so if there's myelin, there must be axons. So myelin appears white, and it indicates the location of axons traveling in the brain. Now, the cerebrum can be anatomically subdivided into different regions called lobes. We'll also look at functional subdivisions of the cortex, but for now we're just doing anatomy. The names of each cerebral lobe correspond to the names of the skull bones that lie over the lobes. So on the diagram, the light blue and dark blue make up the frontal lobe because the frontal bone is on top of it. The parietal lobe is shown in 2 shades of purple, and the parietal bone more or less lies in this region over the brain. And the occipital lobe of the brain is shown in darker green in the posterior region, and the temporal lobe is shown in light green. Notice how the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe have been pulled apart to expose an additional region of the cerebral cortex. This is called the insular cortex. Most of the time the function of this lobe gets ignored, but it is involved in a variety of functions, ranging from the processing of sensory information, the processing of feelings and emotions, autonomic motor control, predicting risk, decision making, self-awareness, and empathy. So it fires when lots of different things are happening. Now, without a diagram that's color-coded, like this picture of an actual brain, it's sometimes hard to distinguish, where the frontal lobe begins, or ends, I should say, and the frontal lobe begins, the dividing point between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. But they are separated by a distinct structure called the central sulcus. And I drew a yellow line on this picture to show where the central sulcus is located. Notice that it extends inferiorly all the way to the temporal lobe. This central sulcus also helps to distinguish between two important gyri. One is in front of the sulcus, and it's called the precentral gyrus, and the other is behind it or posterior to it, so it's called the postcentral gyrus. Both of these gyri relate to somatic pathways. Somatic motor information refers to voluntary control of our skeletal muscles. Somatic sensory information refers to our general senses such as touch, temperature, and pain. So we can see here in this picture that's labeled that somatic motor signals, labeled as somatomotor cortex, are sent to skeletal muscles from the precentral gyrus. For this reason, we often call that precentral gyrus the somatomotor cortex. Somatic sensory information from the rest of our body, like skin and the position of our muscles, skeletal muscles, is sent to the postcentral gyrus. So that's somatic sensory cortex. So the postcentral gyrus is often called that, the somatosensory cortex. You might already be aware of this, but the movement of the right side of your body is controlled by the left side of your brain, and vice versa. This is also true for sensory signals. One side of your body sends signals to the opposite side of the brain, like pain in your left foot would travel to the right postcentral gyrus of the left temporal lobe. To describe how this information is sent, or the pathway, we often use the term contralateral, and that describes that each cerebral hemisphere is related to the opposite side of your body, at least for somatic information. Although I've really emphasized the location of somatic motor cortex and somatic sensory cortex, those two gyri, it is important to acknowledge that lots of areas of the cerebral cortex function together to produce complex sensations and complex motor tasks. The regions work together and they perform these complex things. But we can divide these various regions based on their role. Okay, so a functional way to separate regions of the cerebral cortex would be based on whether it's a primary area or an association area dealing with a certain function. So we're going to talk about what's the difference between a primary area and an association area next. In terms of motor, a primary area is the location where motor pathways to skeletal muscles begin. For example, we already looked at the somatomotor primary area in the precentral gyrus. So that's a primary area. Okay, that's where everything begins. In terms of sensory information, a primary somatosensory area is where sensory input is first received in the cortex. And it's not usually the only location where we become aware of it, but it is first sent to the cortex there. So the primary somatosensory area is that postcentral gyrus that we've already looked at. For association areas, we can also distinguish between motor and sensory, but there's a lot of different types of motor and there's a lot of different types of sensory. They're going to be in different regions of the brain. But in general, a motor association area is where a movement is planned, and a sensory association area is where sensory information is interpreted, where we become aware and we integrate it with all the other sensory signals that we're receiving in our brain. So I'm just going to point out where these primary areas are and the association areas that are important. Okay. First, notice in general, if you see the headings here for motor and for sensory, so here motor is over here on the left and sensory is on the right. Okay. And this is anterior and this is posterior of the brain. Notice right away, that's what I'm trying to say, that in general, motor areas, whether it be primary or association, tend to be located in the anterior part of the brain. Whereas sensory areas, either primary or association, tend to be located in the posterior part of the brain. So now we're going to look at really specific areas. Let's begin with primary areas. You already know where the primary somatic motor information is. Okay, that's the precentral gyrus, and it's where in this gyrus right here that's dark blue, and that's where motor signals originate that are going to our voluntary skeletal muscles. So you also know another one already, the primary somatosensory cortex. This is the postcentral gyrus, and that's where sensory signals from the skin arrive to the cerebrum. Now there's two more. I guess there's three, but there's really only two that I care that you know a lot about, primary areas anyway. And they are the primary sensory area involved with vision or sight. So that is not somatic sensory. That's a special sense, right? So this is the primary visual cortex here in the occipital lobe, where signals from the retina arrive in the cerebrum. And then the fourth primary area that you should be aware of is the primary auditory cortex. So this is in the temporal lobe, it's orange here, and this is where signals from our inner ear are sent to the brain, to the cerebrum. We'll do association areas in a little bit. So this slide lists those primary areas that I'd like you to know. There's 4 of them. The primary somatomotor cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex, the primary visual cortex, and the primary auditory cortex. And one thing that's really interesting about the primary somatic cortex or cortices, both motor and sensory, is that they're highly organized based on where a signal is being sent or received from. So let's just take how first the primary somatomotor cortex and how it's organized. Its organization, remember we're in the precentral gyrus and this is the right side of the brain. The organization is based on where the signal is going to go to, because this is motor leaving the brain going out to muscles. And this picture on the bottom is known as a functional homunculus, showing the proportion of the cortex that's devoted to movement of a certain part of the body. It also represents or gives us an idea to the degree that a body part is innervated by neurons, meaning like how many neurons must control that part of the body. So this just displays the location of the cortex that sends signals out to different parts of the body. Look at the amount of cortex devoted to moving our fingers. That represents the complex movements that we can make with our fingers. Now the primary somatosensory cortex is also likewise organized in a very specific manner. So again, I've got the right side of the brain and we're looking at the postcentral gyrus. And we can look again at the functional homunculus that shows us the amount of cortex that receives information, receives sensory information from different parts of the body. Notice how much is devoted to our face, right? And our tongue. And our fingertips, a lot of sensory information, right? As opposed to the amount devoted to the trunk, for example, which is a bigger surface area, but we don't have as discrete, we can't distinguish as well between discrete locations of sensory information from the trunk. Okay, now let's look at association areas. There are both motor association areas and sensory association areas, and the same thing holds true. We'll see motor anterior and sensory posterior. There are 6 different association areas that you should be aware of, what they do and where their location is. The first is the motor association area. This is where movements are planned, and it's located in the frontal lobe, anterior to the precentral gyrus. It also includes, this motor association area, a really specific region known as Broca's area. It's named after a scientist who discovered that this is where the plans for producing speech, how your tongue and lips move to produce speech, this is where the motor signals originate. Now, somatosensory association areas, the somatic is in the parietal lobe, and this is where we integrate sensory information to help us perceive stimuli and incorporate it with our memory to interpret these different sensations. And not far inferior from this somatosensory association area is Wernicke's area. And notice how close it is to the auditory area as well. So I'm going to talk about Wernicke's area here. Again, it's named after a scientist. Wernicke's area is the region of the cortex that we use when we interpret written or spoken language. So clearly, if we're listening to spoken language, this is where those auditory signals first arrive, but then probably are relayed to Wernicke's area for us to interpret. And if we are reading, right, then that information will first go to the visual cortex, but have to be sent to Wernicke's area. So the visual association area, as I already mentioned, is where we interpret visual stimuli. And the sixth that you should be aware of is this auditory association area. It helps us distinguish between different types of sounds like a crying baby, a thunderstorm, a car horn, your alarm clock, whatever. Those different association areas and what they do are listed on this slide just to help you take notes. I probably don't want to bore you by going over them all again, but there's 6 association areas that you should be aware of. I want to just take a minute to talk about this prefrontal cortex region, the pink region. It is a very complex association area. It does partake in motor control, but it is more well known for our ability to solve complex problems, which will involve memory and learning. It is involved with our intellect and how cognitively aware we are of ourself and our surroundings. It contributes to our personality and willpower. It often controls our emotional responses by inhibiting other lower parts of the brain. And so it contributes to our behavior and social judgment as well. So prefrontal cortex does quite a bit. All right, let's move beyond the cortex and go deeper into the cerebrum now. And deep to the cerebral cortex, there's both gray matter and white matter. We call the white matter tracts. And you can see white matter located in these regions on this frontal section of the brain. It's a frontal section of the brain. So this is superior and this is inferior here. And these are lateral ventricles right there. Okay. So the white matter are called tracts, and they contain groups of axons that are carrying impulses to or from the same location. Axons tend to travel in groups when they can, before they have to deviate and go somewhere different. And then I've also included some information that's not in your study guide on gray matter that's deep in the cerebrum. These regions are called nuclei, and in fact it's because they appear dark due to the presence of the nuclei of cell bodies. Again, gray matter always looks gray or dark because the cell has a nucleus and organelles, and it just looks dark. Okay, so I've named some of these here, like the basal ganglia, the substantia nigra. These are regions of gray matter that are related to motor function. Okay, and we'll talk about them here in a second in more detail. So let's first just look at this picture, get our orientation. Again, this is superior. Down here is inferior, where the spinal cord would begin. This space is a lateral ventricle, and here's another lateral ventricle. They're separated by that membrane called the septum pellucidum. And there is a lot of white matter located deep in the cerebrum, right? But to focus on the gray matter, I want to just introduce you to the basal ganglia, sometimes called the basal nuclei. They consist of the caudate, the region the purple arrow is pointing to that's dark, the putamen, and the globus pallidus for sure. There's some variations depending on which anatomist is describing the basal nuclei, but those are the regions, okay? And these areas contribute to the control of movement because they receive sensory input from lots of different areas of the brain and then pass that sensory information on to the primary motor cortex before it sends out final instructions to your skeletal muscles. Imagine that while I type, all of this is happening. So sensory information comes into the brain, gets sent to the basal ganglia, that gets sent to my motor cortex, and my motor cortex tells me where to move my fingers. It's just, it's quite amazing. I wanted to tell you that degeneration of the caudate and the putamen ganglia is associated with Huntington's disease, which is a genetic disorder. And I also labeled another gray region in the brain called the substantia nigra. It's named because nigra meaning black and it's substantial, I guess. Technically, it's not really part of the cerebrum, but its gray matter is involved in motor control, just like the other nuclei. And when this region degenerates, we get Parkinson's disease. So another movement disorder. Okay, but what is part of your study question involves the white matter deep in the cerebrum. And there are 3 types of white matter tracts of axons, and they're categorized, these 3 types, based on where impulses are traveling to or from. So the 3 types are commissural tracts, projection tracts, and association tracts. Commissural tracts contain axons that are sending signals between the 2 hemispheres. Either it's going from the right to the left or the left to the right. So the corpus callosum is a perfect example of that. That is a white matter tract that carries signals between the 2 hemispheres. Okay. Projection tracts, our second type, carry information that's traveling up and down between high cerebrum to lower CNS, like lower parts of the brain or the spinal cord, or vice versa, from low to high. So superior to inferior, back and forth. An example that you can see that I've shown you here is the internal capsule. The orange arrow points to it, but I can kind of outline it on the other side over here. That's called the internal capsule. You don't have to know what it carries. Just information going up and down. And then thirdly, our association tracts. They carry information within the same side of the brain, so the same hemisphere. And you can see on this picture on the lower left, the white matter is radiating to different parts of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, in fact. So this concludes information on the functional anatomy of the cerebrum. Thank you.